Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Bonechill. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Also, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And is it dark outside yet?
Story 1. The neighbor's secret. The moving truck arrived on Maple Street on a Tuesday morning in September, and I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked. Just another family relocating to our quiet suburb, probably chasing the same dream we all were. Better schools, safer streets, a place where the biggest worry was whether the homeowners association would approve your fence color. I was 34 then, working from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant I had plenty of time to watch the new neighbors through my office window. The family seemed normal enough. A man in his 40s with graying temples, a woman with kind eyes who waved at everyone, and a teenage daughter who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The Hendersons, according to the welcome wagon lady who knocked on my door that evening. Lovely people, she said, balancing a casserole dish while gossiping. He's some kind of consultant. She teaches piano. They moved here from Oregon for his work. I nodded politely, but I was already feeling that familiar itch at the back of my mind. The same sensation I'd been experiencing since I was 12 years old. The one I'd learned to ignore, to push down, to pretend didn't exist. It was like a radio tuning into a frequency that shouldn't be there, picking up signals from somewhere I didn't want to acknowledge. The first real incident happened 3 days after they moved in. I was in my kitchen making coffee when I felt it. That electric tingle that started at the base of my skull and spread down my spine like ice water. My hands started shaking, and suddenly I wasn't standing in my kitchen anymore. I was somewhere else, seeing through different eyes, feeling emotions that weren't mine. I was in the Henderson house, looking through their living room window at my own home across the street, but I wasn't just observing. I could feel what Mr. Henderson was feeling, a mixture of anxiety and something darker, something hungry. He was watching me, through his eyes. I saw myself moving around my kitchen, completely unaware that I was being observed, but it was more than watching. He was studying me, cataloging my habits, my routines, my vulnerabilities. And never with such a sense of immediate danger. I told myself it was stress. Moving to a new neighborhood, dealing with deadlines. Maybe I'd been drinking too much coffee. The rational part of my mind threw out every possible explanation, except the one I knew was true. I could read minds. Not consistently, not controllably, but in moments of high emotion, or when someone was focusing intensely on me. Their thoughts would bleed into mine like water through a cracked dam. It had started when I was 12, right after my father died. At first it was just flashes, brief moments where I'd know what my mother was thinking before she spoke, or catch glimpses of my teacher's private thoughts during class. I'd convinced myself it was intuition, good guesswork, anything but what it actually was. But as I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by broken ceramic and the lingering taste of fear, I couldn't deny it anymore. Over the next few weeks, I tried to avoid Mr. Henderson, but living directly across the street made that nearly impossible. Every time I saw him, I felt that same electrical sensation, that unwanted connection forming despite my best efforts to block it out. What I discovered about my new neighbor made my blood run cold. James Henderson wasn't just watching me. He was hunting me. Through those unwanted mental connections, I learned that he'd moved to our neighborhood specifically because of me. Somehow, he'd identified what I was, and he wanted what I had. The fragments of thoughts I picked up were like pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The ability manifests strongest in isolation, subjects typically unaware of their potential. Previous acquisitions in Portland, Denver, Phoenix. Previous acquisitions, I wasn't his first target. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was having some kind of breakdown, creating elaborate fantasies to explain away coincidences and paranoid thoughts. But the evidence kept mounting. I started noticing things, how he always seemed to be outside when I was trimming hedges that didn't need trimming, checking a mailbox he'd already checked. He was something far worse. He was a collector. In his basement, which I'd seen through his eyes in those terrible dream connections, he kept what he called his trophies. Personal items from his previous targets, a wedding ring from a woman in Portland who could predict accidents before they happened, reading glasses from an old man in Denver who could see people's auras, a child's drawing from Phoenix, from someone who could speak to the dead. All of them had lived alone. All of them had been isolated, struggling to understand their abilities, convinced they were going crazy. All of them had disappeared without a trace. But Henderson wasn't just killing people like us. He was trying to steal our abilities, convinced that if he could figure out how they worked, he could replicate them. His basement wasn't just a trophy room, it was a laboratory. Through our unwanted connection, I felt his certainty that I was special, different from the others. My ability was stronger, more developed. I could see deeper into minds, access memories and thoughts that others couldn't reach. I was his holy grail, the key to understanding how these impossible gifts worked. He'd been studying me for months before moving to Maple Street. He knew my routines, my isolation, my complete lack of close relationships. He knew I was the perfect victim. But there was something Henderson didn't know about me, something I'd never told anyone, not even myself, until that moment of terrible clarity. I wasn't just a mind reader. I could do more than see into people's thoughts. In moments of extreme fear or rage, I could push back. I could plant thoughts, create false memories, even influence actions. It was something I'd discovered by accident as a teenager and immediately suppressed, terrified of what it meant, of what it made me. As I felt Henderson's presence growing stronger each day, his plans becoming clearer, I realized I had two choices. I could run, try to disappear, and hope he wouldn't follow, leaving him free to hunt others like me, or I could fight back. The confrontation came on a Thursday night in October. I was in my living room, trying to focus on work, when I felt that familiar electric sensation stronger than ever before. Henderson tried to raise whatever weapon he was carrying, but his hand was shaking too badly. Through our connection, I could feel his growing terror as he realized what was happening, how completely I'd infiltrated his mind. The woman in Portland, I continued, letting his own memories flood through me and back into him with amplified intensity. Sarah Martinez, she begged you to stop. You kept her locked in your basement for 3 weeks, trying to understand how she knew when accidents would happen. By now, Henderson was on his knees, tears streaming down his face as I made him relive every act of torture, every murder, every moment of his victim's terror. But from their point of view instead of his. And the child in Phoenix, I whispered, 8-year-old Marcus Webb. He could talk to his dead grandmother, and you spent 2 months trying to force him to contact your victims so you could ask them how their abilities worked. Henderson was screaming now, a high-pitched wail that barely sounded human, but I wasn't done. I reached deeper into his mind than I'd ever gone into anyone's, past his memories, past his thoughts, into the very core of who he was. And there I planted something new. Every face of every person he'd killed would haunt him now, not just in dreams, but in his waking hours. He would see them in mirrors, in shadows, in the faces of strangers. He would hear their voices calling his name, feel their pain as if it were his own, experience their terror on an endless loop that would make sleep impossible. But most importantly, he would be compelled to confess. Through the neighborhood gossip network, I learned that James Henderson had walked into the local police station at dawn and confessed to multiple murders across 3 states. He provided details that only the killer could know, led them to burial sites, gave them names and dates and methods. They said he seemed relieved, almost grateful to finally tell someone the truth. His wife and daughter moved out the same day. I never saw them again, but that's not the end of the story. 3 months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Henderson's death in prison. Apparently, he'd been found in his cell, having apparently scared himself to death. The autopsy showed he'd died of sudden cardiac arrest, but his cellmate reported that Henderson had been talking to invisible people for weeks, begging them to forgive him, insisting they were standing right there in the room with him. Along with the clipping was a handwritten note. "Thank you for what you did to my son, S-Killer. There are others like Henderson out there, and others like us who need help. If you're ready to stop hiding from what you are, call me." There was a phone number at the bottom, and a signature. Sarah Martinez. The woman from Portland. The one who could predict accidents. The one I thought Henderson had killed. She'd survived, and apparently, so had some of the others. I stared at that note for hours, holding it in hands that wouldn't stop shaking. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone with this terrible gift. There were others, and they'd found a way to fight back against the people who hunted us. But accepting their help would mean acknowledging what I really was, what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. It would mean embracing the darkness I'd spent my whole life trying to suppress. I still have that note tucked away in my desk drawer. Some nights, when I feel that familiar electric sensation telling me someone nearby is thinking thoughts they shouldn't be thinking, I take it out and stare at the phone number. I haven't called yet, but I know I will, eventually. Because now I understand something that terrifies me more than any of Henderson's victims could have imagined. The real horror isn't that people like James Henderson exist. It's that people like me exist to stop them. And what we become in the process of fighting monsters might be worse than the monsters themselves. Every time I use my ability now, every time I reach into someone's mind, I feel a little more of my humanity slip away. I tell myself I'm protecting others, that I'm one of the good ones, that what I did to Henderson was justice. But late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I can't shake the memory of how good it felt to watch him break, how satisfying it was to make him experience every ounce of pain he'd inflicted on others, how easy it would be to do it again. That's the real secret of people like me. We tell ourselves we're different from the monsters, that our abilities make us protectors, heroes even. But power corrupts, especially power over the human mind. And I'm starting to understand why James Henderson could identify us so easily. We recognize each other, monsters and monsters alike. The only difference is which side of the hunt we're on. Story 2. I never wanted to be the person people came to when they needed to forget. It started innocently enough, the way these things always do. I was working as a grief counselor at Riverside Memorial Hospital, helping families process loss, teaching them healthy coping mechanisms, standard therapeutic practices. I'd been doing it for 8 years, ever since I got my degree, and I thought I was good at my job. People seemed to leave my office feeling lighter, more at peace with their pain. I had no idea I was literally taking their memories. The first time I realized something was wrong was during a session with Margaret Chen, an elderly woman whose husband had died in a car accident. She'd been seeing me for months, making remarkable progress through what should have been debilitating grief. But during our final session, something she said made my blood run cold. "You know, Dr. Matthews," she said, smiling peacefully, "it's the strangest thing. I can barely remember David anymore. Not his face, not his voice, not even how he used to make me laugh. I know I loved him, but it's like trying to remember a dream after you wake up." She said it like it was a blessing, like forgetting 43 years of marriage was exactly what she needed to heal. But I knew it wasn't normal. Grief counseling was supposed to help people process their memories, not erase them entirely. That night, I went home to my apartment on Oak Ridge Drive, one of those quiet suburban streets where everyone knows everyone else's business. I'd lived there for 5 years, chosen it specifically because it was peaceful, predictable, the kind of place where the biggest excitement was Mrs. Patterson's garden, club meetings, or Mr. Rodriguez arguing with the mailman about package deliveries. I made dinner, poured a glass of wine, and tried to convince myself that Margaret's memory loss was coincidental. Trauma-induced amnesia wasn't unheard of. Grief could manifest in unusual ways. There were perfectly rational explanations for what was happening, but as I sat in my living room, trying to focus on the television, I became aware of something I'd never noticed before. Scattered throughout my apartment were objects that didn't belong to me. A brass compass on my bookshelf, a child's drawing stuck to my refrigerator, a vintage fountain pen in my desk drawer, a wooden music box on my dresser. I'd never seen any of these things before in my life. With growing dread, I picked up the music box and wound the key. As the tiny ballerina began to turn and a melancholy tune filled the room, I was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of images and emotions that weren't mine. I saw a young girl, maybe 7 years old, dancing in a pink tutu while her father watched from a hospital bed. I felt his love for her, his heartbreak at knowing he wouldn't see her grow up, his desperate wish that she would remember him always. I experienced his final moments, his hand gripping this music box as he whispered her name one last time. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving me gasping on my living room floor with tears streaming down my face. That music box had belonged to one of my clients, Robert Chen, Margaret's late husband, and somehow, I had taken not just Margaret's painful memories of losing him, but Robert's final moments as well. Over the next few days, I examined every strange object in my apartment. Each one triggered the same thing, vivid emotional memories that belonged to my former clients. The compass had belonged to a war veteran who could unstop reliving his time in Afghanistan until I helped him let go of his trauma. The child's drawing was from a mother who'd lost her son in a drowning accident. The fountain pen belonged to an author whose writer's block stemmed from survivor's guilt after a house fire. I wasn't helping these people heal. I was stealing their memories and somehow manifesting physical tokens of what I'd taken, but the horror was only beginning. As I became more aware of what was happening, I started paying closer attention to my sessions. I could actually feel the moment when a painful memory transferred from my client to me. It was like a warm current passing between us, a gentle tug that pulled their suffering into my mind while leaving them with blessed emptiness. And I was getting stronger at it. What had once been accidental was becoming intentional. When a client described a particularly traumatic experience, I found myself reaching out mentally, drawing their pain into myself like a sponge absorbing water. The more memories I absorbed, the more powerful my ability became. Within weeks, I could take years of trauma in a single session. I could reach into someone's mind and selectively remove specific experiences, leaving everything else intact. I could edit their past like a film director cutting scenes from a movie. My clients loved me. They recommended me to friends and family. They wrote glowing reviews online. They sent thank you cards telling me I'd given them their lives back, but I was dying inside. Every memory I absorbed didn't just disappear. It became part of me. I carried the pain of hundreds of people, reliving their worst moments in my dreams, experiencing their trauma as if it were my own. The objects that manifested in my home weren't just tokens. They were anchors, physical reminders of the memories I'd stolen, growing heavier and more oppressive every day. My apartment became a museum of other people's suffering. Wedding rings from failed marriages, photographs of dead children, military medals earned in battles I'd never fought. Each item whispered its story whenever I passed by, filling my quiet suburban home with the echoes of borrowed anguish. The worst part was how easy it would have been to stop. I could have referred my clients to other therapists, found a new career, moved away from Oak Ridge Drive and tried to build a normal life. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew the truth about what I was doing. I wasn't just taking their pain. I was addicted to it. There's something intoxicating about carrying that much human experience, about being the repository for so much raw emotion. I felt more alive, more connected to the human condition than anyone had a right to feel. The memories I absorbed gave me insights into the depths of human suffering that made me feel almost godlike in my understanding. And there was something else, something I barely admitted to myself in my darkest moments. I liked being needed. I liked being the person who could take away pain that no one else could touch. I liked the gratitude in my clients' eyes, the way they looked at me like I was some kind of miracle worker, even if that miracle was built on theft. The situation escalated when I started seeing Detective Ray Sullivan, a police officer who'd been involved in a school shooting. 23 children had died while he hesitated outside the building, and the guilt was eating him alive. His captain had ordered him to seek therapy or face suspension. During our first session, Ray described the scene in excruciating detail, the sound of gunfire echoing through the hallways, the screaming, the sight of small bodies lying motionless on classroom floors, his paralysis as other officers rushed past him into the building, the look in the shooter's eyes when they finally cornered him. I could have helped Ray process this trauma in healthy ways, taught him coping mechanisms, guided him through the long journey of healing that real recovery requires. Instead, I took it all. In one session, I absorbed 20 years of Ray's career, every violent crime scene, every dead body, every moment of helplessness he'd ever experienced. I pulled his guilt and self-hatred into myself like poison being sucked from a wound. Ray walked out of my office that day a new man. The weight that had been crushing him for months was gone. He could sleep through the night, eat meals without feeling sick, look at himself in the mirror without seeing a coward. But that night, alone in my apartment surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of stolen memories, I experienced every moment of that school shooting from Ray's perspective. I felt his terror, his self-loathing, his helplessness as children died while he stood frozen in the hallway. I relived it over and over, trapped in an endless loop of someone else's worst day. And on my kitchen table, where it hadn't been that morning, sat a small teddy bear with a bullet hole through its chest. That's when I realized the truth about my ability. I wasn't just taking memories, I was collecting souls. Each traumatic experience I absorbed brought with it a piece of the person who'd lived it. And those pieces were accumulating inside me like sediment in a riverbed. I was becoming a living graveyard of human suffering, but I couldn't stop even knowing what it was costing me, what it was turning me into. I couldn't give up the power when the next client walked into my office. A young mother whose toddler had been killed by a drunk driver. I reached into her mind and took every memory of her son. She left my office unable to remember his name, his face, the sound of his laughter. She couldn't recall his first steps, his favorite bedtime story, or the way he used to curl up in her lap when he was scared. I had stolen 2 years of motherhood from her in exchange for ending her grief, and in my apartment that night a new object appeared. A small plastic dinosaur, well worn from tiny hands, sitting on my mantelpiece like an accusation. As my reputation grew, my client list expanded. Word spread through the suburban community of Oak Ridge about the miracle therapist who could make trauma disappear completely. People drove from other states to see me, desperate souls carrying burdens they could no longer bear. I took them all: a firefighter who couldn't forget the family he'd failed to save from a house fire, a surgeon who'd lost a child on the operating table, a mother whose daughter had been murdered, a veteran who'd accidentally killed civilians in a drone strike. Each one left my office empty and peaceful, while their pain took up residence in my mind. My apartment became a shrine to collective human suffering. Every surface was covered with objects I'd never purchased, physical manifestations of stolen memories. The walls seemed to pulse with borrowed anguish. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of accumulated trauma, and I was losing myself entirely. I couldn't remember my own childhood anymore, couldn't distinguish between my memories and the thousands I'd absorbed. Was the scar on my knee from falling off my bike when I was 8, or from when Private Jenkins stepped on an IED in Kandahar? Did I really have a sister who died in a car accident, or was that Mrs. Patterson's story? I'd become a hollow vessel filled with other people's pain, and I was drowning in it. The end came during a session with a teenage girl named Emma Rodriguez. She'd been sexually assaulted at a party, and her parents brought her to me hoping I could help her move past the trauma. She was Mr. Rodriguez's daughter, the same Mr. Rodriguez who argued with our mailman. She lived just 3 houses down from me, had grown up on the same quiet street where I thought I'd found peace. As Emma sat in my office, describing her assault in halting whispers, I felt that familiar hunger rising in me, the urge to reach out, to take her pain, to give her the gift of forgetting that all my other clients treasured so much. But as I prepared to steal her memories, something stopped me. Maybe it was because I'd watched her grow up, seen her riding her bicycle in circles in her driveway, noticed her leaving for school every morning with a backpack covered in band patches. Maybe it was because taking her memories would mean living with them myself, adding sexual assault to the already overwhelming collection of traumas I carried. Or maybe it was because, looking into her eyes, I saw myself at 17, scared, alone, carrying a burden too heavy for someone so young. For the first time in months, I did my job the right way. I helped Emma process her trauma instead of stealing it. I taught her coping mechanisms, helped her understand that what happened to her wasn't her fault, guided her through the difficult but necessary work of healing. It was the hardest session I'd ever conducted. Watching her struggle with pain I could have taken away with a thought, but when she left my office, she left with her memories intact, changed by her experience, but still herself, still whole. That night I sat in my apartment surrounded by the artifacts of stolen suffering, and made a decision that should have been obvious months earlier. I started calling my former clients, one by one, offering to return what I'd taken. Most of them hung up on me. They didn't want their pain back. couldn't understand why I would offer to restore memories they were grateful to have lost. But a few listened, and to those few, I explained what I'd really done. The process of returning stolen memories was excruciating. Each one felt like tearing off a piece of my own soul. I had to relive every traumatic experience in vivid detail, as I pushed it back into its original owner's mind. Some clients thanked me, understanding that they needed their pain to be truly human. Others cursed me for destroying the peace I'd given them. But as I returned each stolen memory, the corresponding artifact in my apartment disappeared. The music box, the compass, the teddy bear, all of them fading like morning mist as their associated traumas found their way home. It took me 3 months to return everything I'd stolen. By the end, my apartment was empty except for my own belongings, and my mind was my own again. I remembered my real childhood, my actual experiences, the person I'd been before I became addicted to other people's suffering. I resigned from my position at the hospital and moved away from Oak Ridge Drive. I couldn't look at Emma Rodriguez anymore without remembering what I'd almost taken from her. I couldn't walk past the houses of my former neighbors, knowing I'd stolen pieces of their souls. I work as a night security guard now, at a warehouse on the outskirts of a city where nobody knows my name. It's quiet, solitary work that doesn't require me to interact with people's deepest traumas. I spend my nights walking empty corridors, checking locks, making sure nothing gets stolen. The irony isn't lost on me. But sometimes, in the early morning hours, when the warehouse is absolutely silent, I feel that familiar hunger stirring again. When I read about tragedies in the newspaper or see footage of disasters on the television, I wonder what it would be like to take away that pain, to carry those memories myself. And I know that someday, probably sooner than I want to admit, I'll give in to that hunger again, because the truth about my ability isn't that it's a curse or a gift, it's an addiction. And like any addict, I tell myself I can control it, that next time will be different, that I'll only use my power to help people who really need it. But deep down, I know better. The quiet suburban neighborhood where I live now doesn't know they have a memory thief living among them. They see a polite, helpful man who keeps to himself, who offers to help carry groceries or shovel snow from driveways. They don't know that every interaction is a test of my willpower. They don't know that when Mrs. Chen next door cries herself to sleep over her dead husband, I feel that familiar tug, the urge to take away her pain. They don't know that I've already started collecting again. Last week a small photograph appeared on my dresser, a picture of an elderly man I've never met, smiling at a wedding I've never attended. I don't remember taking any memories recently, but the photograph is there nonetheless, proof that my hunger is stronger than my conscious control. I tell myself I'll throw it away tomorrow, that I'll move again, start over somewhere else, find a way to resist the temptation. But I know I won't, because the most terrifying thing about discovering you have a supernatural ability is learning what you can do. It's learning what you're willing to do to keep doing it. Story 3. I used to think everyone experienced time the same way I did, until I accidentally saved my daughter's life by stopping a moving truck with my bare hands. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in March, on the tree-lined streets of Willowbrook Estates, the kind of suburban paradise where every house has a 2-car garage and every lawn is perfectly manicured. I was 36 then, working as an insurance adjuster, living what I thought was a completely ordinary life with my wife Sarah and our 8-year-old daughter Lily. Lily was riding her bike in our driveway, practicing the wobbly turns she'd been working on since Christmas. Sarah was inside preparing dinner, humming some song I couldn't quite identify through the open kitchen window. It was one of those perfect domestic moments that you never appreciate until they're about to be destroyed forever. The delivery truck came around the corner too fast, the driver distracted by his GPS, not seeing the small figure on the pink bicycle, who had just wobbled into the street chasing a ball that had rolled off our lawn. I was standing by our mailbox, sorting through bills and advertisements, when I looked up and saw what was about to happen. The truck was maybe 50 feet away. Lily was directly in its path, and there wasn't enough time for anyone to do anything about it. That's when the world changed. Not the world itself, but my perception of it. Everything around me slowed to an impossible crawl. The truck's wheels, which had been spinning at 30 miles per hour, were now barely rotating. The expression of dawning horror on the driver's face was progressing frame by frame like a movie in slow motion. Lily's hair, which had been streaming behind her as she pedaled, was now floating in the air like she was underwater. But I was moving normally. No, that's not quite right. I was moving faster than normal, my thoughts crystal clear, my body responding with perfect precision. I dropped the mail and ran toward the truck, covering 50 feet in what felt like a few seconds, but must have been microseconds in real time. When I reached the vehicle, it was still crawling forward at its impossibly slow pace. I placed my hands on the front bumper and pushed, feeling the enormous mass resist my touch. But somehow, impossibly, the truck began to stop. Not gradually, not with the screaming brakes and skidding tires you'd expect, but smoothly, as if I'd simply reached out and caught a falling ball. The moment I stopped the truck, time snapped back to normal speed like a rubber band being released. The driver, a young man with wide eyes and trembling hands, stared at me through his windshield. Lily, still on her bike, was frozen 3 feet from the truck's bumper, her mouth open in a perfect O of surprise. From somewhere behind me, I could hear Sarah screaming my name. "Did you just... .. The driver stammered, climbing out of his truck. "How did you... .. I looked down at my hands. They weren't even scratched, despite the fact that I'd just stopped a 2-ton vehicle with them. There was no logical explanation for what had happened, no rational way to explain how I'd moved that fast or generated that much force. "I don't know," I told him, and it was the truth. But it wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Over the next few days, as the shock wore off and I tried to convince myself that adrenaline and luck had combined to create a perfectly timed miracle, I started remembering other incidents, small things I'd dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Like the time in college when I'd been in a car accident and sworn I'd had several minutes to react to something that should have happened in milliseconds. Or the morning last year when I'd watched Sarah slip on ice in our driveway and seemed to have all the time in the world to catch her before she hit the ground. Or the dozens of times I'd finished complex tasks at work in what felt like hours, but turned out to have taken only minutes according to everyone else. I started paying attention to these moments, these little temporal hiccups, that I'd been unconsciously smoothing over my entire adult life. What I discovered terrified me more than if I'd found out I had terminal cancer. I could slow down time, not literally, I don't think. I wasn't actually manipulating the flow of temporal reality or anything that grandiose, but I could shift my perception, accelerate my thoughts and reactions to such a degree that the rest of the world appeared to move at a fraction of its normal speed. During these episodes, I could think faster, move quicker, and accomplish impossible things in the spaces between seconds. At first I tried to convince myself it was a gift. How many people died every year because they couldn't react fast enough to prevent accidents? How many tragedies could be avoided if someone had just a few extra moments to intervene? I told myself I could be a hero, a guardian angel watching over Willowbrook Estates and keeping my neighbors safe. But as I experimented with my ability in secret, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Time wasn't the only thing I was manipulating during one of my experiments. Triggered by the stress of watching Sarah nearly cut herself while chopping vegetables, I slipped into that accelerated state and gently moved the knife away from her fingers. When time returned to normal, Sarah blinked in confusion and said, "That's weird." I could have sworn I was cutting onions, but somehow I finished the whole salad. She had no memory of the accident, no recollection of the knife slipping or her fingers coming dangerously close to the blade. It was as if those moments had been edited out of her experience entirely. I started testing this effect more deliberately, always telling myself it was for good reasons. When our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, had a heart attack while mowing his lawn, I slipped into accelerated time, called 911, performed CPR, and positioned him in the recovery position before time resumed. To everyone else, it appeared that I'd reacted with impossible speed and precision, but Mr. Peterson had no memory of the actual heart attack itself, only of suddenly feeling better and finding himself surrounded by paramedics. When a gas leak in the Henderson's house could have caused an explosion, I used my ability to shut off the main valve and open all the windows. The family never knew how close they'd come to dying, never experienced the terror that should have accompanied such a near-death experience. I was editing reality, creating a version of events where bad things almost happened but didn't quite, where people were saved without ever knowing they'd been in danger, and I was becoming addicted to the power. The problem with being able to prevent every accident, stop every disaster, save everyone from every possible harm, is that you start to see potential threats everywhere. Every time Lily rode her bike, I saw a dozen ways she could be hurt. Every time Sarah drove to work, I imagined all the accidents that could claim her life. Every day became an exhausting catalogue of catastrophes that only I could prevent. I started slipping into accelerated time more and more frequently, sometimes for hours at a stretch, patrolling our neighborhood like an invisible guardian. I would walk through our suburb while the rest of the world moved like statues, checking for gas leaks, loose power lines, icy sidewalks, anything that could pose a threat to the people I'd appointed myself to protect. But constant vigilance came with a price I hadn't anticipated. The more time I spent in that accelerated state, the more disconnected I became from normal reality. Conversations felt painfully slow, as if everyone around me was speaking through thick molasses. Television shows became unwatchable. Even reading was frustrating, because my mind was processing words faster than my eyes could track across the page. Worse, I was aging. Not visibly, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but I could feel it. Every hour I spent in accelerated time was an hour of additional wear on my body and mind. While everyone else experienced a single second, I was living through minutes or even hours of subjective time. I was literally living faster than the people around me, burning through my lifespan at an accelerated rate. Sarah started commenting on how tired I looked, how distant I seemed. Lily asked why Daddy was always spacing out during their games. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, present but not really there, watching my family from behind a barrier of stolen time. The breaking point came during Lily's 9th birthday party. We'd invited the whole neighborhood, transformed our backyard into a carnival of balloons and streamers and sugar-hyped children. Sarah had spent weeks planning every detail, and Lily was radiating the kind of pure joy that only children can achieve, when everything in their world is exactly as it should be. I was standing by the patio, watching the kids play Pin the Tile and the Donkey, when I noticed Tommy Martinez, the hyperactive 6-year-old from 2 streets over, climbing onto our deck railing. He was trying to reach a balloon that had gotten caught in the maple tree's lower branches, stretching farther and farther over the 15-foot drop to our stone patio below. Without thinking, I slipped into accelerated time. The party froze around me. Children stopped mid-laugh, their faces locked in expressions of delight. Sarah paused while pouring punch, the liquid hanging in the air like a crystalline sculpture. Lily stood motionless next to her cake, her eyes bright with birthday happiness, and Tommy continued his slow-motion fall toward the stone patio. I walked across the frozen scene, gently caught Tommy's small body, and lifted him back onto the deck. I moved the balloon closer to the railing so he could reach it safely, then positioned myself nearby to make it look like I'd simply reacted quickly. When I let time resume, Tommy grabbed the balloon with a whoop of triumph. Never knowing how close he'd come to serious injury or death, the party continued without missing a beat. Children laughing, adults chatting, everyone having the perfect day we'd planned. But as I watched the celebration continue, I realized I couldn't feel any of it. Not Tommy's gratitude, because he didn't know what I'd done. Not relief at preventing another accident, because preventing accidents had become routine. Not joy at my daughter's happiness, because I was observing it from outside of time, disconnected from the emotional flow of the moment. I had become so focused on protecting my family's happiness that I'd forgotten how to participate in it. That night, after the guests had gone home and Lily had fallen asleep surrounded by new toys, I tried to explain to Sarah what had been happening to me. Not the supernatural aspects, those I kept to myself, but the feeling of disconnection, of being somehow outside of our life together. "You've been different," she admitted, curled up next to me in our bed, distant. "Like you're always thinking about something else, something I can't reach." She was right. I was always thinking about something else. About the next potential disaster, the next accident I might need to prevent, the next moment when I need to slip between the seconds to keep our perfect suburban life intact. "I feel like I'm losing you," she whispered, not to another woman or anything like that, but to something I don't understand. "It's like you're here but not here, like you're living in some other timeline." She had no idea how literally true that was. Over the next few weeks, I tried to stop using my ability. I forced myself to experience time at normal speed, to let small accidents happen, to accept that I couldn't prevent every possible harm that might come to the people I loved. It was agony. I watched Mrs. Chen slip on ice and scrape her knee, knowing I could have prevented it. I saw Mr. Peterson's dog run into traffic, knowing I could have stopped it. I witnessed a dozen minor disasters every day that I could have fixed in the space between heartbeats. But I gritted my teeth and let them happen because I was beginning to understand that my constant intervention wasn't protecting the people I loved. It was protecting them from the experience of being human, from the small pains and close calls and moments of genuine fear that make life real and meaningful. The real test came on a Saturday morning in June. Lily was in our front yard, practicing soccer kicks with her friend Emma from down the street. I was washing my car in the driveway, forcing myself to stay present in normal time when I saw a drunk driver weaving down our street at 40 miles per hour. He was going to hit both girls. This wasn't a scraped knee or a frightened dog. This was death approaching my daughter at high speed, and I had the power to stop it. For a split second that felt like hours, I stood frozen between two impossible choices. I could let time flow normally and watch my daughter die, preserving some abstract principle about the natural order of things. Or I could slip into accelerated time, save her life, and accept the consequences of continuing to live outside of normal reality. In the end, there was no choice at all. Time slowed to its familiar crawl, and I ran toward my daughter, ready to pay any price to keep her safe. But as I reached Lily and Emma, something unexpected happened. Instead of simply moving them out of the way, I found myself experiencing their terror in real time. I felt Lily's confusion as she saw the car approaching, Emma's scream of fear, the split second of pure animal panic that precedes tragedy, and I realized that by constantly shielding them from these moments, I'd been stealing something essential from their lives. The fear, the relief, the gratitude that comes from surviving something dangerous. These weren't experiences to be edited out. They were part of what made life precious. So instead of preventing the accident entirely, I did something different. I slowed down just enough to give the drunk driver time to see the girls and slam on his brakes. I let the fear happen, let the close call register in everyone's minds, let the full emotional weight of the moment play out naturally. When time resumed, the car skidded to a stop just feet from where the girls stood, frozen in terror but unharmed. They would remember this moment for the rest of their lives, would have nightmares about it, would be more careful around cars because of it. And that was exactly as it should be. The drunk driver was arrested. The girls were shaken but safe. Sarah held Lily close and cried with relief and anger and gratitude all mixed together. It was messy and traumatic and perfectly, beautifully human. I never used my ability again after that day. Not because I lost it, I don't think. Even now, years later, I can feel it lurking just beneath the surface of my consciousness, ready to activate the moment I need those extra seconds between seconds. But I've learned something that took me too long to understand. The moments that matter most aren't the ones we can control. They're the ones that happen too fast to prevent, to suddenly to edit, to genuinely to improve upon. They re the scraped knees and close calls and genuine fears that remind us we re-alive and mortal and connected to each other in ways that transcend time itself. Lily is 16 now, a careful driver who always checks her mirrors twice and never texts while behind the wheel. She doesn't remember why she's so cautious around cars, but the lesson learned in that moment of terror has kept her safe in ways my intervention never could. Sarah and I are closer than we've ever been, living fully in each moment we share, knowing that time is precious. Precisely because we can't slow it down, or speed it up, or edit out the parts that scare us. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and I'm lying awake listening to my family breathe, I feel that familiar temptation to slip between seconds to check on them one more time to make sure they're safe in ways that normal time can't guarantee. But I resist, because I've learned the most terrifying truth about having power over time. The real horror isn't that we can't control every moment, it's that we might choose to try. And in doing so, we risk missing the very experiences that make those moments worth protecting in the first place. Story 4. I killed my first person with a compliment on a Tuesday morning in September, and I didn't even realize I'd done it until I read about her suicide in the newspaper 3 days later. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she lived 2 houses down from me on Sycamore Lane, one of those quiet suburban streets where everyone waves when they pass each other jogging, and the biggest drama is usually someone forgetting to bring in their trash cans on collection day. I'd seen her around the neighborhood for months, a thin woman in her early 30s who always seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. That morning, I was walking to my mailbox when I saw her struggling with grocery bags in her driveway. She'd dropped one, and oranges were rolling everywhere while she stood there looking like she was about to cry over something as simple as spilled fruit. "Let me help you with those," I called out, jogging over to collect the scattered oranges. As I handed them back to her, I noticed how exhausted she looked, how her hands were shaking slightly as she took the bag from me. "You know," I said, trying to brighten her day, "you're handling everything so well. I don't know how you manage it all, but you're stronger than you think." It was just politeness, the kind of empty encouragement people offer when they don't know what else to say. But something strange happened when the words left my mouth. For just a moment, I felt a weird sensation, like a warm current flowing from me to her, and Jennifer's entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders straightened, Her hands stopped shaking. A smile spread across her face, transforming her from someone on the verge of breakdown to someone radiating confidence and inner strength. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was completely different, steady, assured. "You're absolutely right. I am stronger than I think." She carried her groceries inside with a spring in her step that hadn't been there moments before, and I walked back to my house feeling good about helping a neighbor in need. It wasn't until later that I realized what I'd actually done. I'd given her the strength to kill herself. The newspaper article was small, buried on page 7 of the local section. Local woman takes own life after long battle with depression. The details were sparse, but the timeline made my stomach drop. Jennifer Walsh had committed suicide on Thursday night, less than 48 hours after our conversation, leaving behind a note that praised her newfound strength and clarity about what needed to be done. I told myself it was coincidence. Depression was complex, unpredictable. People made tragic decisions for reasons that had nothing to do with well-meaning neighbors offering bland encouragement. But deep down, I could unshake the feeling that my words had somehow pushed her over an edge she'd been teetering on for months. That feeling got stronger when I started paying attention to the other things I said and the effect they had on people. My name is David Carson, and I'm a high school English teacher at Meadowview High, about 20 minutes from Sycamore Lane. I'd been teaching for 12 years, long enough to develop what I thought was a natural gift for knowing exactly what to say to motivate struggling students. Kids who'd been failing my class would suddenly find their footing after one of our conferences. Shy students would become confident speakers after I encouraged them to find their voice. Troublemakers would transform into model pupils after I helped them see their potential. I'd always attributed this success to experience, intuition, and caring about my students. But after Jennifer Walsh's death, I started wondering if something else was at play. The first test came during a parent-teacher conference with Maria Santos, whose son Carlos was failing English despite being obviously bright. Maria was a single mother, working 2 jobs. Exhausted from trying to hold her family together while her ex-husband contributed nothing but broken promises and missed child support payments. "I don't know what to do with him anymore," she confided, sitting across from my desk with tears in her eyes. "He used to be such a good kid, but lately he's angry all the time, getting into fights, talking back. I feel like I'm failing him." I could have given her the standard advice about consistency and communication, maybe recommended counseling resources. Instead, I found myself leaning forward and saying, "Maria, you're not failing him. You're exactly the mother Carlos needs right now. Your strength is holding your family together, and he sees that even when he can't express it. Trust yourself." As the words left my mouth, I felt that same warm current I'd experienced with Jennifer Walsh, like something flowing from me into Maria. Her posture changed instantly. The doubt and exhaustion faded from her face, replaced by a fierce determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "You're right," she said, and her voice carried a conviction that hadn't been there moments before. "I am strong enough for this. Carlos needs boundaries, not guilt trips from me." The change in Carlos was immediate and dramatic. Within a week he was participating in class discussions, turning in assignments on time, and treating his classmates with respect. When I asked him what had changed, he shrugged and said, "Mom's different now. More sure of herself, I guess. Makes me want to be better too." That's when I understood what I was really doing. I wasn't just offering encouragement or motivation, I was implanting qualities directly into people's personalities, rewriting their self-perception with nothing more than carefully chosen words. When I told Maria she was strong, I wasn't just boosting her confidence. I was literally making her stronger, giving her character traits she hadn't possessed before our conversation. The realization terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Over the next few months, I experimented cautiously with this ability. I told my neighbor Bob Peterson that he was a natural leader, and watched him get elected to the Homeowners Association board within a week. I told my shy student Emma Rodriguez that she was born to perform, and she landed the lead in the school play despite never having auditioned for anything in her life. I told the aggressive kid Jake Morrison that he was really a protector at heart, and his bullying behavior transformed into standing up for younger students. Every time I spoke these transformative words, I felt that warm current flowing out of me, and every time the person I was speaking to became exactly what I told them they were. But I was beginning to understand that this wasn't necessarily a gift. The problem with being able to reshape people's personalities with words is that you start to see everyone around you as a rough draft in need of editing. Every personality flaw becomes something you could fix. Every struggle becomes something you could solve. Every human limitation becomes a challenge you could overcome with the right combination of syllables. I started looking at my neighbors on Sycamore Lane differently. Mrs. Chen was too anxious, always worrying about her garden and her late husband's unpaid bills. A few words about her natural calm and wisdom could fix that. Mr. Rodriguez was too aggressive with door-to-door salespeople and delivery drivers. I could easily make him more patient and kind. The teenage Thompson boy was headed down a bad path with drugs and petty theft. One conversation could turn him into the responsible young man his parents desperately wanted him to be. The temptation was overwhelming. But every time I considered using my ability, I thought about Jennifer Walsh, and the terrible possibility that my words of encouragement had given her the strength to do something irreversible. What if the qualities I was implanting in people weren't actually improvements? What if I was just imposing my own vision of who they should be, erasing the complicated, messy, authentically human parts of their personalities? The crisis came during the spring semester, when one of my students, a quiet girl named Ashley Park, came to me after class in obvious distress. Ashley was brilliant but struggled with crippling social anxiety that made it difficult for her to participate in group discussions or present her ideas to the class. Her grades suffered not because she didn't understand the material, but because she couldn't bring herself to speak up or ask questions when she needed help. "Mr. Carson," she said, fidgeting with her backpack straps, "I know I'm not doing well in class, and I'm sorry, I just ... I can't seem to find my voice, you know. I have all these thoughts and ideas, but when it comes time to share them, I freeze up." It would have been so easy to fix her. 3 sentences about her natural confidence and charismatic personality, and Ashley's social anxiety would evaporate like morning dew. She'd become the outgoing, articulate student I knew she could be. Her grades would improve, her future opportunities would multiply. But as I looked at her nervous, earnest face, I realized something that changed everything. Ashley's quietness wasn't just a flaw to be corrected. It was part of who she was, part of what made her unique and valuable. Her careful consideration before speaking meant that when she did contribute to discussions, her comments were thoughtful and insightful. Her sensitivity to social dynamics made her an excellent listener and a trusted confidant for her friends. Her struggle with anxiety had developed her empathy and her appreciation for small acts of kindness. If I fixed her, I wouldn't be helping Ashley become her best self. I'd be erasing Ashley entirely and replacing her with someone else. Someone who fit my idea of what a successful student should look like. "Ashley," I said carefully, choosing my words with deliberate precision, "what you're experiencing is more common than you think. Let's work together on some strategies that might help you feel more comfortable participating in class. But let's do it in a way that honors who you are naturally." I felt the familiar warmth building as I spoke, the current that wanted to flow from me to her and remake her in my image of confidence and outgoingness. But this time, I held it back. Instead of transforming her personality, I simply offered practical advice, smaller group discussions, written responses she could read aloud, opportunities to meet with me one-on-one to practice articulating her ideas. It was harder work, for both of us. Ashley's progress was slower, more gradual, marked by setbacks and small victories rather than dramatic transformation. But it was real progress, built on her actual personality rather than an artificial one I'd imposed on her. And watching her genuine growth, seeing her slowly find her authentic voice rather than the one I might have given her, taught me something crucial about the nature of human development. Real growth is messy, it's slow, it's full of failures and false starts and moments of doubt. But it's also genuine, earned, and sustainable in ways that magical personality transplants could never be. That realization led me to a horrifying understanding of what I'd been doing to people. Every time I'd used my ability, I'd been committing a kind of murder. Not physical death, but the death of who that person actually was. Maria Santos, Bob Peterson, Emma Rodriguez Carlos, Jake Morrison. All of them had ceased to exist the moment I rewrote their personalities with my words. The people walking around in their bodies now were artificial constructs, built to my specifications, rather than developed through their own experiences and choices. I'd been so focused on helping people become better that I'd never stopped to ask whether the people I was creating were actually them at all. The guilt was crushing. Every success story from my classroom, every neighbor whose life had improved after one of our conversations, every student who'd found confidence and direction after talking with me, they were all victims of a crime they didn't even know had been committed against them. But the worst part was the addiction. Even knowing what I was really doing, even understanding the moral horror of erasing people's authentic selves, I couldn't stop wanting to use my ability. Every time I encountered someone struggling, someone whose life would obviously be improved by a small personality adjustment, the temptation was almost irresistible. When I saw Mrs. Chen crying over her husband's medical bills, I wanted to give her the strength to handle financial stress. When Mr. Rodriguez got into a shouting match with a delivery driver, I wanted to install patience and understanding in his character. When I heard about Ashley Park getting panic attacks before college interviews, I wanted to retroactively fix the social anxiety I'd chosen to leave intact. The power to solve people's problems with words was intoxicating. Even when I knew that solving those problems meant destroying the people who had them, I started avoiding social interactions, afraid that I might slip up and accidentally reshape someone's personality in a moment of weakness. I stopped giving advice to students, limited parent conferences to purely factual discussions about grades and assignments, and withdrew from the neighborhood community I'd once been so eager to help. But isolation only made the temptation stronger. The breaking point came during the last week of school, when I overheard two students talking about Ashley Park's suicide attempt. She left this note. One of them was whispering about how she couldn't handle the pressure anymore, how she felt like she'd never be strong enough for the real world. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Ashley, the quiet, thoughtful girl I'd chosen not to fix, had tried to kill herself because she could uncope with the very anxiety I could have eliminated with a few carefully chosen words. Standing there in my empty classroom, surrounded by the echoes of a school year ending, I faced an impossible choice. I could continue avoiding my ability, letting people suffer with problems I could solve, watching them struggle with limitations I could erase. Or I could accept that sometimes, reshaping someone's personality might be the lesser evil compared to letting them destroy themselves. But there was a third option, one that scared me more than either of the others. I could tell someone else what I was capable of, not the full truth. That would sound like the ravings of a madman. But I could find another teacher, a counselor, someone with experience in helping troubled students, and guide them toward the insights that could help kids like Ashley without supernatural intervention. It would be slower, less certain, dependent on other people's willingness to listen and act. But it would preserve the authenticity of the people we were trying to help while still offering them genuine support. That summer, I started volunteering with a local crisis intervention hotline, working alongside trained counselors who knew how to guide people through their struggles without fundamentally changing who they were. I learned techniques for active listening, for helping people find their own strength rather than installing artificial confidence, for supporting authentic growth rather than imposing personality transplants. It was harder work, and the results were less dramatic. But they were real results, achieved by real people working through real problems with their actual personalities intact. I still feel the temptation every day when I see someone struggling, when I know that 3 sentences could transform their entire life. The urge to speak those transformative words is almost overwhelming, but I resist, because I've learned the most important lesson of my teaching career. The goal isn't to fix people, the goal is to help them fix themselves, in their own way, at their own pace, with their own authentic personality leading the process. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do with words isn't to use them to change someone. It's to choose not to use them at all, and trust that the person standing in front of you is exactly who they're supposed to be, struggles and all. Even when that choice means watching them suffer with problems you could solve with a whisper. Even when that choice means accepting that some people, like Jennifer Walsh, might not survive their authentic journey through darkness. Because the alternative, a world full of people who are perfect, but not themselves, is a kind of hell I refuse to create, no matter how good my intentions might be. Story 5. The dream walker. I discovered I could enter other people's dreams on the same night my marriage fell apart, though it took me weeks to realize the two events were connected. It was a Thursday in October, and Linda and I had just finished the worst fight of our 15-year marriage. She'd accused me of being emotionally unavailable, of living in my own world, of caring more about my consulting work than our relationship. I responded with the usual deflections and half-hearted apologies that had become my standard defense against her increasingly desperate attempts to reach me. I feel like I'm married to a ghost, Michael, she'd said, standing in the doorway of our bedroom in our split-level house on Elmwood Drive. You're physically here, but mentally you're somewhere else entirely. I do not know how much longer I can live with someone who refuses to let me in. She'd gone to sleep in the guest room that night, and I'd lain awake in our king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling the familiar weight of guilt and confusion that followed our fights. I loved Linda, had always loved her, But she was right about my emotional unavailability. There was something inside me that kept everyone at arm's length, even the person I'd promised to share my life with. I must have fallen asleep around 3 a.m. because the next thing I knew, I was standing in our kitchen watching Linda make coffee. But something was wrong with the scene. The kitchen was too bright, the colors too vivid, and Linda was wearing a sundress I'd never seen before. When she turned to smile at me, her face was radiant in a way that seemed almost supernatural. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, and her voice carried none of the tension and frustration that had characterized our recent interactions. "I made your favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup." I looked down at the plate she was offering me, and the pancakes were perfect. Not just well made, but literally perfect, each one identical to the others. The blueberries distributed with mathematical precision, the syrup forming geometric patterns as it drizzled down the sides. That's when I realized I was dreaming. But this wasn't my dream. I never dreamed about domestic scenes like this, never fantasized about perfect breakfasts or sundresses or kitchen conversations. This was Linda's dream, and somehow, impossibly, I was inside it. I could feel her subconscious mind around me like a warm ocean, filled with hopes and fears and memories that belonged to someone else. In her dream logic, we were the couple she wished we could be. I was attentive and present, genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings. She was confident and radiant, secure in my love instead of constantly fighting for my attention. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. I tried to speak, to interact with Dream Linda the way real Linda had always wanted me to interact with her, but the moment I opened my mouth, the dream began to dissolve around me. The perfect kitchen faded like watercolors in rain, and I found myself back in our bedroom, staring at the empty space where my wife should have been sleeping. Over the next few weeks, I discovered I could slip into other people's dreams almost at will. It started accidentally, during moments when I was emotionally connected to someone or thinking intensely about them as I fell asleep. But gradually, I learned to control it, to consciously project my awareness into the sleeping minds of people around me. My neighbor, Tom Bradley, dreamed about being a rock star, performing for screaming crowds in arenas that defied physics. Mrs. Patterson from across the street had recurring nightmares about her late husband, who appeared in her dreams as a disapproving specter, criticizing everything from her housekeeping to her choice in television programs. The teenage girl next door, Sophie Martinez, had anxiety dreams about school that manifested as endless hallways filled with locked doors she couldn't open. At first I was just an observer, a voyeur peering into the most private spaces of the human psyche, but I quickly discovered I could do more than just watch. I could influence the dreams, change their direction, even participate in them as if I were a natural part of the dreamer's subconscious. When Tom Bradley's rockstar fantasy turned into a nightmare about forgetting the words to every song, I whispered the lyrics into his sleeping mind and watched his confidence return. When Mrs. Patterson's husband began his nightly criticism, I transformed him into a loving, supportive presence who praised her strength and independence. When Sophie found herself trapped in those endless hallways, I manifested keys that opened every door, leading her to classrooms where she excelled at every subject. I told myself I was helping people, using my strange ability to bring comfort to troubled sleepers, turning nightmares into pleasant dreams and insecurities into moments of triumph. But the truth was more complicated than that. I was becoming addicted to the intimacy. Inside someone's dream, you experience their deepest emotions, their most secret desires, their rawest fears and purest joys. You feel what they feel, want what they want, fear what they fear. It's a level of connection more complete than any waking relationship could provide. A total merger of consciousness that makes ordinary human interactions seem shallow and artificial by comparison. And it was destroying my ability to connect with people in the real world. When I tried to have conversations with Linda during our waking hours, I found myself frustrated by the barriers between us. Why couldn't she just open her mind the way she did in dreams? Why did we have to fumble around with words and gestures when I knew exactly what she was thinking and feeling in her sleep? I started spending more and more time in other people's dreams and less time engaging with their conscious selves. Why struggle through awkward small talk with Tom Bradley when I could rock out with him in his fantasy concerts? Why listen to Mrs. Patterson complain about her arthritis when I could visit the dream version of her where she danced with her husband in fields of wildflowers? The problem was that the people I was connecting with in their dreams weren't really them. They were idealized versions, stripped of the complications and contradictions that make real humans so difficult to understand. Dream Linda was everything I wished my wife could be. But she wasn't actually Linda. She was a projection of Linda's desires, filtered through my own need for an uncomplicated relationship. The real Linda was getting lonelier and more frustrated every day, while I was falling in love with a fantasy version of her that existed only in her sleeping mind. The situation came to a head during one of my nightly visits to Linda's dreams. I'd been doing it for weeks, slipping into her unconscious fantasies almost every night, experiencing the warmth and connection she craved, but couldn't achieve with the real me. That night, her dream was different. Instead of the usual domestic bliss scenarios, she was dreaming about leaving me. In the dream, she was packing suitcases in our bedroom, but she wasn't sad or angry. She was relieved, almost euphoric, as she folded clothes and placed photographs in boxes. Dreamy stood in the doorway watching her, but this version of myself was understanding and supportive, helping her carry boxes to a car that would take her somewhere new and bright and full of possibility. "I'll miss you," Dreamy said, "but I want you to be happy. You deserve someone who can give you what you need." Dream Linda smiled and kissed my cheek. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for finally letting me go." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding with the realization that Linda's subconscious mind was already preparing for our separation. Even in her dreams, the fantasy version of our relationship was ending, which meant the real relationship was probably beyond saving. But instead of using this insight to work on our marriage, to finally give Linda the emotional availability she'd been begging for, I did something that still makes me sick to remember. I started changing her dreams. Night after night, I slipped into Linda's sleeping mind and rewrote the scenarios her subconscious was creating. When she dreamed about leaving me, I transformed those dreams into renewed romance and connection. When she dreamed about being alone and independent, I filled those dreams with longing for home and partnership. When she dreamed about other men, other possibilities for love and companionship, I inserted myself into those dreams as the ideal partner she'd been searching for. I was essentially brainwashing my wife through her dreams, manipulating her subconscious mind to want things that aligned with my needs rather than her authentic desires. And it worked. Linda's attitude toward me began to change. The constant fighting stopped. She became more affectionate, more willing to overlook my emotional unavailability, more content with the limited connection I was able to provide in our waking life. She stopped talking about couples therapy or separation, stopped pushing for the deeper intimacy she'd always craved. From the outside, it looked like our marriage was healing, but I knew the truth. Linda hadn't chosen to stay with me or work on our relationship. I'd programmed her to stay through dream manipulation, replacing her authentic feelings with artificial contentment. The guilt was eating me alive, but I couldn't stop. The alternative, losing Linda, seemed worse than the moral horror of what I was doing to her sleeping mind. I told myself that everyone was happier this way, that a marriage based on manipulated dreams was better than no marriage at all. I was wrong. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Linda started having trouble distinguishing between dreams and reality. She would reference conversations we'd never had, remember romantic gestures I'd never made, talk about places we'd never visited together as if they were cherished memories. "Remember our trip to Paris last spring?" she said one morning over coffee, smiling at me with the same radiant expression she wore in her dreams. "The way you surprised me with dinner at that little cafe near the Eiffel Tower." We'd never been to Paris together. We'd never taken a romantic vacation anywhere. But in her dreams, I'd been the perfect husband who whisked her away on surprise trips and made grand romantic gestures. The boundary between her dream life and waking life was dissolving, and it was my fault. Linda started experiencing what she described as waking dreams, vivid hallucinations where she saw and interacted with the idealized version of me that I'd been projecting into her sleep. She would have entire conversations with this phantom husband, becoming frustrated and confused when the real me didn't respond the way her dream me always did. She began staying in bed longer and longer each day, preferring the dream world where our marriage was perfect to the waking world where I remained emotionally distant and unavailable. She lost interest in her job, her friends, her hobbies, everything except the increasingly elaborate fantasy life I'd created in her sleeping mind. By Christmas, Linda was spending 16 to 18 hours a day asleep, and when she was awake, she was disoriented and detached, like someone recovering from anesthesia. She moved through our house like a ghost, interacting with memories and hallucinations more than with physical reality. I'd turned my wife into a dream addict, and the drug she was addicted to was a fantasy version of our relationship that I force-fed into her subconscious mind. The final crisis came on New Year's Eve, when Linda didn't wake up at all. She was breathing, her vital signs were stable, but she wouldn't respond to any external stimuli. It was as if she'd decided to live permanently in the dream world I'd created, abandoning reality entirely for the perfect marriage that existed only in her manipulated unconscious mind. I called 911, and the paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong with her. Blood work, brain scans, neurological tests, everything came back normal. Linda was simply choosing not to wake up, though they couldn't explain why. That night, sitting in the hospital waiting room, I made a decision that terrified me more than anything I'd ever done. I was going to enter Linda's dream one final time, not to manipulate or change anything, but to tell her the truth about what I'd been doing and give her the choice to wake up or stay trapped in the fantasy I'd created. When I slipped into her sleeping mind that night, I found myself in a version of our house that was impossibly beautiful and warm, filled with the golden light of eternal sunset. Linda was there, radiant and happy, surrounded by evidence of the perfect life we'd supposedly built together. Photo albums full of trips we'd never taken, love letters I'd never written, memories of conversations where I'd been everything she'd ever wanted me to be. "Michael," she said, rushing to embrace me, "I was hoping you'd come home. I've been waiting for you." Looking at her glowing face, feeling the pure love and contentment radiating from her dream self, I almost couldn't bring myself to shatter the illusion. This version of Linda was happier than the real Linda had ever been, living in a world where she was cherished and understood and never had to fight for emotional connection. But she wasn't real, and keeping her trapped in this artificial paradise was killing the person she actually was. "Linda," I said, and my voice cracked with the weight of what I was about to confess. "None of this is real. Our perfect marriage, these beautiful memories, the way I've been treating you in your dreams. I created all of it. I've been manipulating your sleep, changing your dreams to make you want things that aren't authentic to who you really are." The dream began to flicker and fade around us as the truth penetrated her subconscious defenses. The golden light dimmed, the perfect house began to show cracks and wear, and the radiant expression on Linda's face slowly gave way to confusion and horror. "You've been inside my dreams," she whispered. "You've been changing them." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I was losing you, and instead of working on myself, instead of becoming the husband you needed, I decided to change you instead. I turned you into someone who would be satisfied with the emotional scraps I was willing to give." The dream world collapsed entirely, leaving us standing in a gray void that reflected the emptiness of our actual relationship. But Linda was still there, still herself, and for the first time in months, I was seeing her authentic reaction rather than a manipulated response. "I need to wake up," she said quietly. "I need to remember who I really am, separate from what you made me dream." "I know," I replied, "and I'll understand if you never want to see me again. What I did to you was unforgivable." Linda looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing not just my betrayal, but the months of false contentment I'd forced into her subconscious mind. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said finally. "I don't know which feelings are mine and which ones you planted. I need time to figure out what's real." She faded from the dream, and I felt her consciousness pulling away from mine, returning to the waking world. When I opened my eyes in the hospital waiting room, a nurse was shaking my shoulder. "Mr. Thompson, your wife is awake. She's asking for you." Linda recovered physically within a few days, but the psychological damage took much longer to heal. She moved out of our house on Elmwood Drive and into an apartment across town, needing space to rediscover her authentic self without the influence of my dream manipulation. We spent months in couples therapy, working through not just our original communication problems, but the deeper violation of trust that my ability had created. Linda had to learn to distinguish between her genuine feelings and the artificial contentment I deprogrammed into her dreams. I had to learn to connect with people in the messy, imperfect, but authentic ways that real relationships require. It took 2 years, but we eventually rebuilt our marriage on a foundation of honest communication rather than dream manipulation. Linda forgave me, though she never forgot what I'd done, and I learned to resist the temptation to take shortcuts through other people's unconscious minds. I still have the ability to enter dreams, but I don't use it anymore. The intimacy of dreamwalking was intoxicating, but it wasn't real intimacy. It was a voyeuristic violation of the most private spaces of the human mind, and any connection built on that foundation was doomed to be artificial and ultimately destructive. The real horror of my ability wasn't that I could invade people's dreams. It was how easy it was to convince myself that manipulating them was an act of love rather than an act of control. Because when you have the power to give people exactly what they think they want, it's tempting to forget that what they think they want isn't always what's good for them. And it's even more tempting to forget that the perfect relationship you can create in someone's dreams is no substitute for the imperfect but genuine connection you can build in waking life, where both people have to choose every day to love each other despite their flaws and limitations. That choice, difficult as it is what makes love real. Everything else is just a beautiful dream that leaves you hollow when you wake up. Story 6. I started seeing people's true selves in mirrors the day after my 42nd birthday, and within a month, I understood why some truths are meant to stay hidden. It began as nothing more than a strange double take. While I was getting ready for work in my bathroom on Cherry Hill Road, I'd lived in the same colonial-style house for 8 years, part of a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, and the biggest excitement was usually someone getting a new car or planting an ambitious garden. I was brushing my teeth, going through the same morning routine I'd followed for years, when I caught a glimpse of something unusual in the mirror. For just a split second, the reflection of my neighbor Paul Chen, visible through my bathroom window as he retrieved his newspaper, looked different. Instead of the friendly, slightly overweight accountant I'd known for nearly a decade, I saw something else entirely. The face in the reflection was sharp, predatory, with eyes that held a cold calculation that Paul had never displayed in any of our casual conversations about property taxes and weekend barbecues. The expression was there for maybe half a second before snapping back to Paul's familiar, harmless features, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. I convinced myself it was eye strain, maybe a trick of the morning light filtering through the bathroom window, but over the next few days, similar incidents kept happening. Quick flashes in store windows, car mirrors, any reflective surface that caught both my face and someone else. Would occasionally show me something that didn't match what I was seeing with direct vision. Mrs. Rodriguez from 3 houses down, who organized neighborhood potlucks and always asked about my mother's health, appeared in reflections with a face twisted by bitter resentment and barely contained rage. The teenage Thompson boy, who seemed like any other awkward 6-year-old, cast a reflection that looked decades older, marked by a weariness and cynicism that no teenager should possess. At first, I thought I was having some kind of breakdown. The stress of my divorce 2 years earlier, the isolation of living alone after 20 years of marriage, maybe it was all catching up with me in the form of visual hallucinations. I made an appointment with my doctor, got my eyes checked, even saw a therapist for a few sessions. But the reflections kept getting clearer, more detailed, impossible to dismiss as tricks of light or products of stress. The breakthrough came during a neighborhood block party in late June. The whole street had turned out for the annual summer barbecue, one of those suburban traditions that made Cherry Hill Road feel like the kind of place where nothing truly terrible could happen. I was standing near the Henderson's garage, holding a beer and making small talk with Bob Martinez about his new lawnmower, when I caught sight of the crowd reflected in the garage's large windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. The reflection showed the same people, in the same positions, having the same conversations, but their faces were completely different, where I saw friendly neighbors chatting and laughing. The reflection revealed a gathering of strangers wearing masks of civility over expressions of contempt, desperation, and barely controlled violence. Bob Martinez, who was enthusiastically describing his mower's mulching capabilities, appeared in the reflection with dead, hollow eyes and a face marked by the kind of deep sadness that comes from decades of disappointment. Mrs. Patterson, laughing at someone's joke near the food table, cast a reflection that looked consumed with envy and spite, her pleasant smile replaced by a sneer of pure malice. But the most disturbing reflection belonged to Jennifer Walsh, the young mother who demoved to our street just 6 months earlier with her husband and 2 small children. In direct vision, she was the picture of maternal bliss, chatting with other parents while keeping one eye on her toddler playing nearby. But her reflection showed someone else entirely. The face in the window was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with the kind of desperation I'd seen in documentaries about addiction and mental illness. But worse than the physical changes was the expression, a mixture of rage and hopelessness that suggested someone capable of terrible things when pushed too far. I couldn't stop staring at Jennifer's reflection, trying to reconcile the loving mother I was observing with the broken, dangerous person I was seeing in the glass. That's when she noticed me watching and walked over with her characteristic warm smile. "Michael, right," she said, extending her hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Jennifer Walsh." I shook her hand, forcing myself to focus on her actual face rather than the twisted reflection I could see in the window behind her. "Nice to meet you officially. How are you settling into the neighborhood?" "Oh, it's wonderful," she said, and her voice carried genuine enthusiasm. "Everyone's been so welcoming, and it's such a safe place to raise children. Sometimes I can hardly believe we're lucky enough to live somewhere so perfect." But even as she spoke these optimistic words, her reflection was mouthing something entirely different. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the expression was one of bitter sarcasm, and the gestures were aggressive, almost violent. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with understanding what I was seeing. I started carrying a small compact mirror, positioning myself to catch reflections of people during conversations, comparing what they showed me to what I observed directly. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and horrifying. The reflections weren't showing me random distortions or symbolic representations. They were revealing what people would look like if their inner selves, their true thoughts and emotions and hidden desires, were reflected in their physical appearance instead of being concealed behind socially acceptable facades. Bob Martinez's hollow-eyed reflection matched his inner state perfectly. Behind his friendly demeanor and enthusiasm for lawn care, he was drowning in depression following his recent job loss and his wife's cancer diagnosis. The dead look in his reflected eyes was the face of someone who'd given up hope, but was still going through the motions of normal life. Mrs. Patterson's envious, spiteful reflection revealed her true feelings about the neighborhood. She resented the younger families, hated watching other people's children grow up healthy and happy while her own son struggled with addiction in another state. Her pleasant conversations and helpful gestures masked a bitterness that was eating her alive from the inside. And Jennifer Walsh's desperate, rage-filled reflection told a story that made my stomach turn. I started watching Jennifer more carefully, using my ability to see past her perfect mother act to the truth underneath. What I discovered was a woman on the edge of complete psychological collapse, held together by nothing more than determination and pharmaceuticals. Through her reflections, I could see that she was battling severe postpartum depression, self-medicating with prescription drugs and alcohol, and struggling with violent impulses toward her own children. The loving mother everyone saw was a performance she maintained through sheer willpower, while inside she was screaming. The worst part was that I was the only one who knew. Jennifer's husband, David, was completely oblivious to his wife's mental states. In conversations with him, I learned that he worked long hours as a consultant, traveling frequently, leaving Jennifer alone with 2 young children for days at a time. He praised her constantly for being such a natural mother, never suspecting that she was fighting every day not to hurt the children she was supposed to protect. I faced an impossible choice. I could see that Jennifer was dangerous, that her carefully maintained facade was cracking and something terrible was going to happen. But how could I warn anyone without revealing my supernatural ability to see people's true selves in reflections? Who would believe such an absurd claim? I tried indirect approaches. I suggested to David that Jennifer seemed tired. Maybe she could use some help with the kids or a weekend away. I mentioned to Mrs. Patterson, who was friends with Jennifer, that new mothers sometimes struggled with depression and might need support. I even called the family services hotline anonymously, expressing concern about a neighbor, but without concrete evidence of abuse or neglect, there was nothing they could do. Meanwhile, Jennifer's reflection was getting worse every day. The desperation in her face was deepening, the rage was becoming more prominent, and I started seeing her make violent gestures toward her children even when she was speaking to them in loving tones. The crisis came on a Tuesday afternoon in August. I was working in my garden when I heard screaming from the Walsh house, not the normal sounds of children playing, but genuine terror. I dropped my tools and ran toward the sound, arriving at their front door at the same time as Mrs. Patterson and Bob Martinez. Through the window, we could see Jennifer standing in her living room, holding a kitchen knife while her 2 children cowered behind the couch. She was still wearing the mask of normalcy, speaking in a calm, gentle voice, but the reflection in the window behind her showed the truth. Her true face was twisted with rage and desperation, tears streaming down hollow cheeks, mouth moving in what looked like apologies, even as she raised the knife. "Jennifer," I called through the door. "It's Michael from down the street. Can you let us in?" She turned toward the door, and for a moment her actual face slipped, showing a flash of the desperation I could always see in her reflections. But then the mask snapped back into place, and she smiled her perfect mother smile. "Oh, hi Michael. Everything's fine here. The kids were just playing a little too rough." But her reflection was screaming, and I could see her grip tightening on the knife. I made a decision that probably saved 3 lives, though I've never been sure it was the right one. "Jennifer," I said, loud enough for Mrs. Patterson and Bob to hear, "I can see your reflection in the window behind you. I can see what's really happening. You don't want to hurt your children, you're just sick, and you need help. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then Jennifer's careful facade crumbled entirely. She dropped the knife and collapsed to the floor, sobbing with the kind of raw desperation I'd been seeing in her reflections for weeks. Mrs. Patterson called 911 while Bob and I managed to get the door open and secure the scene. The children were terrified but unharmed, and Jennifer didn't resist when the paramedics arrived to take her to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation. In the aftermath, I had to explain to the police, to David Walsh, to concerned neighbors, how I'd known Jennifer was in crisis. I told them I'd noticed signs of depression, changes in her behavior, that I'd been worried about her mental state for weeks. It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Jennifer spent 2 months in inpatient treatment, working through her postpartum depression and the deeper psychological issues that had been building for years. When she came home, she was different. Not cured exactly, but honest about her struggles in a way she'd never been before. I kept thinking I had to be perfect. She told me during one of our conversations after her return, the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect neighbor. I thought if I could just maintain the image long enough, eventually I'd become the person everyone thought I was. Looking at her reflection in my kitchen window as we talked, I could see that she was still struggling, still fighting dark thoughts and desperate impulses. But now her actual face matched her reflection more closely. The mask was gone, replaced by genuine effort to heal rather than perform. The experience with Jennifer changed how I viewed my ability. At first, I'd seen it as a curse, a burden of knowledge about people's hidden darkness that I didn't want to carry. But I began to understand that maybe the real curse wasn't seeing people's true selves. Maybe the real curse was how desperately people needed to hide those true selves, even from themselves. Over the following months, I started paying attention to my own reflection, curious about what truth it might reveal. What I saw disturbed me more than any of my neighbors' hidden darkness. My reflection showed someone consumed with loneliness and bitterness, marked by years of failed relationships and professional disappointments I'd never fully acknowledged. The divorce I thought I'd handled maturely had left me more damaged than I'd admitted. The friendly neighbor facade I presented to everyone on Cherry Hill Road was hiding someone who felt fundamentally disconnected from other people, someone who'd given up on genuine intimacy and settled for superficial pleasantries. I was just as false as everyone else, just as desperate to maintain an image that didn't match my inner reality. The difference was that now I could see it. That awareness forced me to make changes I'd been avoiding for years. I started therapy, real therapy this time, not just a few sessions to rule out mental illness. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. I joined a support group for divorced men, admitting for the first time how isolated and angry I'd become. It was hard work, much harder than maintaining the pleasant mask I'd been wearing. But gradually, my reflection began to change. The bitterness faded, the loneliness became less desperate, the face in the mirror started to look more like the face I showed to the world. I still have the ability to see people's true selves in reflections. I probably always will. But I've learned not to judge them for the darkness I see there, because I understand now that everyone is fighting battles they can't share, carrying pain they can't express, struggling to maintain facades that protect them from judgments they're not ready to face. The real horror isn't that people have hidden depths of anger, sadness, and desperation. The real horror is how alone they feel carrying those depths, how convinced they are that their true selves are too damaged or dangerous to be accepted by anyone else. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone isn't to expose their truth or force them to confront their authentic self. Sometimes the kindest thing is to accept their facade, to let them maintain their mask until they're strong enough to remove it themselves. Because the choice to show your true face, the decision to let your reflection match your reality, that's something each person has to make for themselves, even when you can see exactly what they're hiding from everyone else, including themselves. Story 7. I've lived Tuesday, October 15th exactly 2,847 times, and I still can't save everyone I love. The first time through, it was just an ordinary day in my ordinary life on Maple Ridge Drive. One of those quiet suburban streets where the biggest crisis is usually someone's sprinkler system malfunctioning or a package being delivered to the wrong address. I was 45 years old, recently remarried to Sarah, a wonderful woman who'd somehow seen past my cynicism and emotional baggage to find something worth loving. That Tuesday started like any other. Sarah made coffee while I showered. We discussed dinner plans over breakfast. She kissed me goodbye and drove off to her job at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade. I had a consulting deadline to meet, so I planned to work from home all day, a routine that had become comfortable in the 2 years since we'd moved to this neighborhood together. At 2:47 p.m., a drunk driver ran a red light 6 blocks away and slammed into Sarah's Honda Civic as she was returning from her lunch break. She died instantly, according to the paramedic who called me from the scene. I remember the phone ringing, the professional but gentle voice explaining that there had been an accident. The way the world seemed to tilt sideways as the words sank in. I remember driving to the hospital in a state of shock, sitting in a waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and despair, signing papers that made Sarah's death official. I remember going home to our empty house, walking through rooms that still held traces of her morning routine, and collapsing in our bedroom as the reality hit me. Sarah was gone. The woman who'd given me a second chance at happiness, who'd made me believe I was capable of being loved, despite all my flaws, was dead, because some asshole decided to drink and drive on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I went to bed that night drowning in grief and rage, wishing desperately for just one more day with her, one more chance to tell her how much she meant to me. When I woke up, it was Tuesday, October 15th again. At first, I thought it was just the disorientation of grief, the way trauma can make time feel fluid and unreal. But as the day progressed exactly as it had before, every conversation happening with forward, every event unfolding in precisely the same sequence, I began to understand that something impossible was occurring. I was reliving the same day. By the 3rd loop, I was certain. By the 10th, I was experimenting. By the 100th, I understood the rules. Every night at exactly 11:59 p.m., time would reset. I would wake up in my bed on Tuesday morning with complete memory of every previous loop, but everyone else would be experiencing the day fresh, with no awareness of the repetition. Sarah would make the same coffee, we'd have the same conversation about dinner. She'd leave for work at exactly 8:23 a.m., and at 2:47 p.m., unless I intervened, she would die in the same intersection, killed by the same drunk driver who was currently sleeping off his Monday night bender, unaware that he would destroy 2 lives in 6 hours. The first thing I tried was simple prevention. I called Sarah at 2:30 p.m. and convinced her to stay at school late, grading papers or preparing lessons. It worked. She avoided the intersection entirely, and I spent the evening in a euphoria of relief, believing I'd solved the problem. But when I woke up the next morning, it was Tuesday, October 15th again. Saving Sarah from that specific accident wasn't enough. The loop continued regardless, trapping both of us in the same day. Even when I successfully prevented her death, over the next few dozen loops, I tried everything I could think of. I called in bomb threats to keep Sarah at school. I faked emergencies that required her to come home early. I even physically prevented her from leaving the house, claiming to be sick and needing her care. Each time, I successfully kept her alive through October 15th. Each time, I woke up to Tuesday morning again. That's when I realized the horrible truth about my situation. I wasn't trapped in this day to save Sarah. I was trapped to watch her die, over and over, in an endless variety of ways. When I prevented the car accident, she slipped on wet leaves and cracked her skull on the school's concrete steps. When I kept her home, she had an allergic reaction to something in her lunch and couldn't reach her EpiPen in time. When I convinced her to take a different route to work, a construction accident sent a beam crashing through her windshield. Death, it seemed, was determined to claim Sarah on October 15th, and my efforts to save her only forced it to become more creative. By the 200th loop, I was going insane from the repetition and the constant futile struggle to protect the woman I loved. I tried ending the loop by killing myself, thinking maybe my death would break whatever force was trapping us in this day, but suicide just reset me to Tuesday morning with the memory of my own death added to the growing collection of trauma I was accumulating. I tried killing the drunk driver before he could drink and drive. That prevented the original accident but didn't break the loop, and Sarah died anyway when a gas leak in her classroom caused an explosion. I tried leaving town entirely, driving Sarah hundreds of miles away from anything that could harm her. A freak hailstorm shattered our windshield on the highway, sending glass fragments into her carotid artery. I tried keeping both of us in a padded room with no sharp objects, no electrical devices, nothing that could possibly cause harm. Sarah choked on her own saliva while laughing at something I said, a one-in-a-million medical event that normally only happened to people with severe neurological conditions. By the 500th loop, I understood that I was fighting against something far more powerful than drunk drivers or random accidents. I was fighting against fate itself. against a universe that had decided Sarah's death was a fixed point in time that couldn't be altered no matter how many times I relived this day. But I couldn't give up, even knowing it was hopeless, even understanding that every success would be temporary and every failure would be repeated endlessly. I kept trying to save her. Around loop 800, I started paying attention to other people in our neighborhood, wondering if they were also caught in this temporal prison. What I discovered was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was going to have a heart attack at 4:23 p.m. while watering her roses. Bob Martinez would get a phone call at 5:15 p.m. informing him that his son had been killed in Afghanistan. The teenage Thompson girl would attempt suicide at 7:30 p.m. after being humiliated at school by classmates who didn't understand her struggles with identity and belonging. October 15th wasn't just Sarah's last day, it was the last day for dozens of people in our small suburban community. A convergence of tragedies that made the date itself significant in some cosmic way I couldn't comprehend. And somehow, I'd been chosen to witness all of it, over and over, with the knowledge to prevent any single death, but not the power to break the cycle that made their deaths inevitable. I started experimenting with saving other people instead of Sarah. Maybe the loop would end if I could prevent enough deaths. If I could turn October 15th from a day of tragedy into a day of salvation. I warned Mrs. Patterson about her heart condition and got her to a hospital before the attack. I intercepted Bob's phone call and gently prepared him for the news about his son. I reached out to the Thompson girl and gave her the support she needed to choose life over death. But saving them didn't save Sarah, and even when I managed to prevent every other death I was aware of, when I turned October 15th into a day where nobody died, Sarah would still find some impossible way to leave me. One memorable loop, she was struck by a meteorite. A meteorite. The odds were literally astronomical, but the universe found a way to maintain its chosen narrative despite my interference. By loop 1500, I'd given up trying to break the cycle and started focusing on understanding it. I became an expert on everyone in the neighborhood, learning their secrets, their fears, their deepest regrets. I could predict every conversation, prevent every accident, solve every problem except the one that mattered most. I learned that Mrs. Patterson had been taking care of her disabled husband for 20 years, and her heart attack was brought on by the stress of watching him slowly deteriorate. I learned that Bob Martinez had been estranged from his son for 5 years over the boy's decision to enlist, and the guilt was eating him alive. I learned that the Thompson girl was struggling with questions about her sexuality in a family that wouldn't accept her authentic self. I became a master of living October 15th, able to navigate the day with perfect precision, helping everyone around me in small ways while being powerless to help the person I loved most. Around loop 2000, I had a revelation that changed everything. I was sitting with Sarah at breakfast, having the same conversation we'd had thousands of times before, when I really listened to what she was saying for the first time in loops. I love teaching, she was saying, but sometimes I wonder if I'm really making a difference. These kids have so many challenges, so many problems I can't solve. I just hope that maybe, on some level, I'm helping them feel less alone. That's when I understood the real purpose of my imprisonment in this day. It wasn't about saving Sarah or preventing deaths or breaking some cosmic cycle. It was about bearing witness, about being present for the pain and beauty and terrible fragility of human existence. Every person who was going to die on October 15th was someone who felt alone, isolated, convinced that their struggles were invisible to the world around them. Mrs. Patterson hiding her exhaustion behind a cheerful facade, Bob Martinez carrying guilt he couldn't share. The Thompson girl convinced that her family could never love her authentic self, and Sarah, my beautiful, caring Sarah, wondering if her life had meaning, if her efforts to help others made any difference at all. I couldn't save them from death, but I could make sure they didn't die alone, didn't die believing they were invisible or unloved or insignificant. For the next 800 loops, I focused not on preventing deaths, but on connecting with the dying. I spent time with Mrs. Patterson, listening to her stories about her husband, helping her understand that her devotion hadn't gone unnoticed. I sat with Bob Martinez and helped him find words to express his love for his son, even if it was too late to share them. I became a friend to the Thompson girl, showing her that acceptance was possible even in a world that seemed hostile to who she was. And with Sarah, I stopped trying to save her and started making sure she knew, absolutely and completely, how much she was loved and how much difference she made in the world. On loop 2847, our last loop together, I woke up and made her favorite breakfast. We talked about her students, about the difference teachers make in children's lives, about how love multiplies when you share it instead of hoarding it. I told her everything I'd learned about compassion and connection over thousands of repeated days. At 2:47 p.m., I didn't try to prevent her accident. Instead, I held her hand in the hospital as she died, making sure the last thing she experienced was love rather than pain or fear. When I woke up the next morning, it was Wednesday, October 16th. The loop was broken, but Sarah was still gone. The drunk driver had still killed her. Mrs. Patterson still had her heart attack. Bob Martinez still lost his son. The Thompson girl still took her own life. But something had changed in me, something fundamental and irreversible. I understood now that love isn't about preventing loss or protecting people from pain. Love is about being present for the pain, about making sure no one suffers alone, about witnessing the beauty in people's lives even when those lives are cut short. Sarah is buried in Riverside Cemetery, about 10 minutes from Maple Ridge Drive. I visit her grave every Tuesday, not because I think she is there, but because it helps me remember the lessons I learned during those 2,847 days. I couldn't save her, I couldn't save any of them, but I was there, present and aware and full of love, when they needed someone to see them. And maybe, in the end, that's all any of us can really do for each other. Be present for the pain, bear witness to the beauty. Make sure no one dies believing they're alone or unloved or insignificant, because even if we can't prevent the tragedies, we can prevent them from being meaningless. Even if we can't save everyone we love, we can love them completely while we have the chance, and sometimes, that has to be enough.